I we're both tall, so like they want to.
It's a power move.
That's how we'll just kind of like tower over you.
It's a decision. So, in addition to being like a really propulsive, like you've got all the elements that really make the plot move. It's got a curse.
I like curses.
Curses are great. And yet, it's also, so it's got like classic rom-com elements in a really big way. It's also really funny. And heartbreaking.
Yeah, I did. You know, it's interesting that you mention all of those themes together, because that is something that I really tried to focus on in writing the book, that I was interested in approaching Psyche and Eros as a love story. In many ways it is, but in many ways it's also a very philosophical, Neoplatonic story about the ascent of the soul. But maybe less of a market for that. I think it sounds great. But just to ramble a little bit about the history of where we get the Eros and Psyche myth from, it comes from a novel called The Golden Ass by Lucius Apuleius, which was written in the 2nd century at the fringes of the Roman Empire. And the story of Eros and Psyche actually appears in the middle of the text, when one character tells it to another. So it's this inset story in this wider narrative, but The Golden Ass is one of the surviving novels from that period in antiquity, and I think the reason for it is that it's a really good read.
Yeah.
It's got romance in the form of the Eros and Psyche myth, it's got human-animal transformation, really ridiculous humor, visions of celestial goddesses, really everything you could ever want.
Social commentary?
So, a lot of social, maybe too much, maybe you should have calmed down with that, Apuleius, calm yourself. But the humor is a big part of that, and I think I've heard scholars arguing over, was Apuleius joking? Was he serious? What was happening? And I think he was both all of the time.
Oh my god, no, yes. And actually, so you're also not the first person to tackle retellings of this story. Like, I think that the first retelling of this story I saw was C.S. Lewis's Very Weird Till We Have Faces, and I think that might have been one of the first things I messaged you once I was like, wait, I need to read this book early. Can I have an arc? But also,
you can have an arc.
But also, it was just like, have you read C.S. Lewis's version of this story? It's bananas.
It really is. Well, so.
And it's not funny though.
It's not particularly, well, it's Jesus Lion Boy. He wanted to talk about belief, he wanted to talk about trust. That's lovely. It's a little different from what I wanted to do.
You're both interested in the Neoplatonist allegory angle.
Yeah, really. I like the Neoplatonist allegory. Like, don't you all want that in your rom-coms? But that idea of the ascent of the soul and of the movement of the soul through different ways of being and to ultimate understanding, enlightenment, or just kind of functioning more harmoniously in the world. That's a big theme of the story as well.
Oh, absolutely. There are allusions in the story to it. Characters will sometimes just sort of say, soul, nice name.
Yeah, it's like, that's what Psyche's name means, is soul, and it's like...
Actually, I really liked the butterfly elements. I thought that was a neat move.
That's another meaning of the word psyche
in
Greek, which would be more psyche, but we're not in a classroom right now. I don't think it's anything like that. Psyche means soul, and it also means butterfly, which isn't something that the original myth really plays with in the source text, but it's something that I wanted to play with. But it is interesting you mentioned C.S. Lewis, because reading his work was also very much an influence on Psyche and Eros.
Yeah, he makes a different character, the warrior princess, but
he does.
He definitely goes with those elements, although to a different end. I think a huge part of this journey for your Psyche is, well, can you talk a little bit about heroism?
Absolutely. So in the story, Psyche is kind of raised to be a hero girl, and this was something that I was inspired to do by a really critical reading of the source text. So in the source text, Psyche doesn't have this kind of training, but she overcomes these labors that are given to her by Aphrodite that are really ultimately a parallel to the labors of Heracles. These are the things that define the hero. And so I wanted to zero in on that and focus on it, but also problematize it, because Greek mythological heroes are not unproblematic icons. Oh, we're already laughing at that one. They leave a lot of death and destruction in their wake, and also what distinguishes them is frequently what's the most interesting monster they can kill. So that's something I really wanted to tweak as well. And that's, I think, one reason I call the book feminist is because it really calls into question these patriarchal overarching ideas of that this is the way to be a good and better person. So come for the girls with swords, stay for the deconstruction of patriarchal values. But Maya, I want to hear a little bit more about your book, Wrath Goddess Sin, because I absolutely loved it. You also made some very interesting critiques of the source tags, and you introduced some new characters as well. So I'm trying to figure out what I want to ask you about first, but I think what I want to go with is Helen.
Okay.
So your interpretation of Helen of Troy in the world you built is absolutely singular and incredibly unique. Could you talk a little bit about your interpretation of the myth and the Iliad and how Helen plays into that?
So in a lot of ways, my Helen is a deconstruction of the sort of literary Helens we've come to know and love, because it's more like the Iliad Helen. Iliad Helen is weird. Like
She's so weird.
We first meet her like making a tapestry of her war. She's like, all these people are fighting over me. I'm really powerful right now. She then trash talks Aphrodite and gets threatened for it. Like, she's messy and weird and interesting. And then later on, she controls her own mythological narrative. Stesichorus writes a bunch of anti-Helen verses, and Helen strikes him blind. Helen strikes Homer blind. Like that's apparently supposedly the reason Homer was blinded by the gods was because he was not sufficiently deferential to Helen. And that's an interesting character. Like that's the whole characterization right there. Yeah, your Helen is really interesting too. And actually this segues really nicely to a question I wanted to ask you. So you have definitely taken this is in a lot of ways a Roman vision of the Mycenaean world that this book is set in. So it's like historical fiction, Roman style. And you've woven into the myth of Eros and Psyche, you've woven the protagonists of the Iliad. A lot of them are there. I mean, granted, there are so many protagonists of the Iliad, but like, Helen is there. Achilles and Patroclus are there. Agamemnon is there. We should talk about that.
Well, also, I just want to point out that we had an exchange in the green room before where I was like, Maya, you made me like Agamemnon. And you were like, you made me hate Agamemnon. So, and I think that's one of the beautiful things about mythological retellings is that you can have two people looking at the source material and come away with 3 different opinions. There's so much, at least, yeah. There's so much there, there's so much to explore. But in thinking about a setting for Psyche and Eros, so the original source text, while it was written at the fringes of the Roman Empire, the story of Psyche and Eros itself is very ambiguous about its setting. It just says, in a certain city. So I looked at that and said, well, that's free real estate. Yeah. And I was interested in setting it around the time of the Iliad and the Odyssey because of the sheer number of novels that have come out dealing with that time period. And I also wanted to tweak the perspective a little bit. So it does include these heroes of the Iliad, but they're sort of on the fringes. The Trojan War itself happens off stage for the most part, which I think is how most people at the time would have experienced it, that this is not a war you're fighting in, it's the reason that you can't get the nice Anatolian carpets in the market anymore, or the reason that Dad sailed away and never came back. And in looking at the different characters, I mean, we have very different takes on Agamemnon. My take on Helen is much more of a human being who is overlooked, whose intelligence is overlooked in favor of her beauty, and who's getting much trapped by that. Whereas you have this very supernatural Helen that I
I just sort of rolled her with Eros. But you have Eros
That
as a
makes so much
separate
sense.
character.
Yeah, that makes a ton of sense. Also, with Helen, I feel like everyone forgets that in the Odyssey, she drugs everyone's drinks
she's
at
a
a dinner
witch.
party. Like, she's a nightmare. I love her, but like, people are like talking about the Trojan War, and she's like, time for bed.
I love that scene.
It's really good. Yeah, so yeah, I think that's my thoughts on that.
Cool. Actually, yeah, I think we did talk plenty about the sort of romanity of the story. So, like, you know, want to talk about dolphins, or do you want to talk about Atalanta?
I mean, I always want to talk about Atalanta, but like the dolphins are fun.
Yeah, no, we both ended up putting dolphins.
We both put dolphins in our stories. They are very different, which is kind of an understatement. So a little bit. So my dolphin is part of one of my tweaks to the Eros and Psyche myth was I gave them a loophole. So they can't see each other's faces, but if one of them wears a face that is not their own, then it's a little more loosey-goosey. And the Greek gods are famous for these human-animal transformations. So at a point in the book, I want to hear about that later. I want to hear about that later. So at one point, Psyche is swimming, she encounters a dolphin, she's like, oh, that's so cute. And then the dolphin says, hi, Psyche. And she runs on water for a while. It turns out to be Eros, and so they found that loophole in the curse. So that's where my dolphins come in. Can you talk about your dolphins?
So one of the characters in my book is a sort of Bronze Age linguist who's convinced that she can talk to dolphins if she manages to figure out the right magical approach. And then she does, and it turns out talking to dolphins is not what she expected. They are terrible people. They have opinions, they have ideas, they're constantly harassing her, Oculus, because they're dolphins, and dolphins do that. Dolphins are difficult people. Your dolphin is at least a hot god.
He's not a real dolphin. I think that's what saves him.
Although there is this great moment when he turns into a rooster, and she's like, this is such a beautiful form. It's so lovely. And then she's like, you're a chick.
I actually was asked in a podcast interview which of Eros' animal forms was my favorite. I was like, well, I like the dolphin, but he was so proud of the rooster. And Psyche was just like,
That's actually one of the things I really love about this book. These characters, they're so silly.
I think that harkens back to Apuleius, where there's this debate that, like, is he serious? Is he actually trying to do this very serious Neoplatonic philosophy when he has like donkey fart jokes in the novel, which is the thing that happens. But I think that's just life. Like, life is transcendent and life is also absolutely ridiculous. And so capturing that pathos but also humor was really important.
So tell me more about the gods, because simultaneously you get these moments when they act very godlike, and also they really feel like spoiled Roman nobles a lot of the time. Like, we have all these spoiled Roman nobles letters. Apuleius himself was a minor spoiled Roman noble, and incredibly spoiled subsequently.
Oh my God. I have to do Divergence for an Apuleius story. So Apuleius, our buddy, was put on trial for black magic. A thing that happens to some people in ancient Rome. You know what I'm going to say. So he defends himself in court. We still have his defense speech. It's very thorough, touching on every point, saying he's not a magician, he's a philosopher. But at one point he says, Emilianus, if I was a magician, I'd probably send the souls of the dead after you and they chew your entrails. But isn't it good for you? I'm not a magician. I love the gall here. We're talking about the gods. So
But actually, that story really does elucidate some of the gods.
It is, you know, some of that kind of chutzpah is part of it. But in writing the gods, I really wanted to think about the fact that they are in many ways essentially children with magnifying glasses going after ants. And yet at the same time, they are these immortal beings who have incredible powers, who also have the burden of facing eternity. And that just sounds miserable. Like, an average human life has enough heartbreak and loss and separation and misery. To imagine that stretch over a time period of thousands of years, that's brutal. You know, you have nothing really to look forward to. A lot of the things you see will decay and die. You have other gods who are unstable and nasty and have grudges stemming back millennia. So, in thinking about Eros especially, who I wanted to, you know, one of the narrator characters, I wanted to focus on him. I wasn't sure how to write him at first until I started reading the work of Anne Carson, who's a contemporary scholar, and she points out that the term that Sappho, the poet, uses to describe Eros is glucopikron, which is sweet bitter. Not bittersweet, sweet bitter. And that, the idea of that contrast and that contrary nature was something that I folded into Eros's character. And I also have him as one of the primordial deities emerging from the depths of chaos. But there's the scene where he emerges, he sees the newborn world with the mountains that aren't fully delineated yet, there's nothing growing, plants and animals don't exist yet. And he understands that he's part of this effort to create and populate this new world. And he says, that sounds exhausting, I'm gonna take a nap. And so, seizing onto that character moment and having someone who never quite does what you expect he'll do was very fun in writing this, and hopefully fun in reading it as well.
He's outrageous. He spends so much of the book petty and a little absurd, and he's really easy to like, despite the fact that he's a child with a magnifying glass.
Well, he at least knows to feel bad about the ants that are, he's like, I don't really want to kill these ants, I just want to like do whatever. I want to hang out with my pets in my cool books inside the house.
He does seem like a cat person, which he is.
He's very much. Psyche's a dog person though, so they're gonna have to figure that out.
Psyche is very a dog person.
But you had mentioned in your novel one of your characters being a linguist. Could you tell us more about this character and your inspirations for her? Because I absolutely love her, and well, you're
Alright, well, okay. So Maya Deane is an Egyptian princess who basically brings the fact that the late Bronze Age Greek world was really dominated by Egypt and the Hittites, sort of home to the story. She is married to a major character in the Iliad, that's my addition, and she has a historical grandmother who is the very famous Nefertari, who is fascinating and weird. So in so many ways it was just like, well, if she's all like her grandmother, how strange would her intrusion into the story be? Because this is someone who writes letters back and forth to the Queen of the Hittites, and they're very polite, but then like, the Queen of the Hittites writes to her husband Ramses II, and she's like, you're an idiot. You need to get out of Egypt more, dude. You clearly don't know what's going on in the world. And there's just this fascinating sense of these really powerful queens who are really proud of their sorcery. They leave like, all this bragging about their scribal skills and magical talents in their tombs. Wow, that's so neat.
I remember there's a scene in Wrath Goddess saying where there's an attack on the camp, and like, but they burned half of Mariapi's books! And
Yeah,
like,
no, she's very
this is a terrible
upset.
moment.
She's very upset. And Achilles is like, I will avenge your books.
Yeah, I love that. Can you also talk a little bit about your characterization of Achilles? Because I think she's very surprisingly similar to the Achilles of the Iliad, but there are also some differences as well.
Well, yeah, I mean, it's just like Achilles spends years on the island of Skyros, living as a woman in all of the myths, and yet a lot of the time they're kind of as at pains to kind of explain that away. There's the Roman author Statius, who's like, wow, it's really a manly thing to do because he's mad at his mom the entire time and he uses it to sexually assault the princess of the island. So really hyper masculine. And I didn't love that. But at the same time, Achilles is like a destructive dumbass. So I know a lot of trans women who are beautiful dumbasses. Who, you know, like they're forces of nature, they're super powerful, they'll sweep aside the world, and also they will wreck shit. They'll be like, well, let's just sort of sneak into Troy and see what Helen's up to.
Achilles does that. It goes great for her.
It goes great for her. Yeah, no, it goes great for her. But yeah, at the same time, reading your take on Achilles, I'm just like, well, you know, like, I get it. I actually think Achilles makes more sense as a woman now, because kind of bitchy that always comes through. That I relate to enormously.
I loved your take on Achilles because I've also read that episode on the Island of Skyros.
Yeah.
Like, well, it's the manly thing to do. And I'm like, when is it the cis thing to do to spend years as a woman?
Right.
Something's happening here. So when I saw Rap Goddess sing, I was like, that's a cool take. I like that.
I think it makes more sense.
Also, I just love more female characters.
Oh yeah.
So, delighted to see that.
It's an easy lift.
And also, like, I mean, your Achilles is, she has a arc more towards the people she cares about.
Oh no, we both basically wrote stories where there's a bait and switch where, yeah, we've got these powerful warrior women who ultimately learn to love themselves and others.
And I think that's also an interesting riff on the Iliad as well, because Achilles spends a lot of the Iliad not fighting, like throwing a temper tantrum, frankly. There are these artistic representations. There's a vase of like Achilles literally in a blanket burrito. Have you seen that one? Yes.
My favorite scene in the Iliad is actually the scene where Patroclus is barbecuing, and Achilles is like, I'm not gonna fight, but I missed my friends. I'm glad you guys came to visit. And would you like some of this meat Patroclus is barbecuing? It's so good. He's so good.
Achilles just showing up to the cookout, nothing else. Yeah, you missed everybody because you were throwing a tantrum and not fighting.
Actually, talk about the scene with the griffins.
Oh, yeah. So there's a scene towards the middle end of the novel where Psyche is, I'm trying to think how to phrase this with minimal spoilers, but also give you something interesting to listen to. So Psyche is conscripted to take out this nest of griffins, which in my story are heinous pests for small farmers and for shepherds. They prey on the flocks, it's just a pain. So Psyche kills them as she's trained to do, and after she does this, as she looks at them and realizes that they're a mated pair, this is really the turning point where she starts to realize everything that she has been taught about being a hunter and a warrior and a hero is pretty hollow, and that she hasn't done an incredible thing, and in fact she's destroyed something beautiful.
It's also a great segue into Atalanta, who is the person who trains her to be a hero and also complicates that.
Yes. Oh, I love Atalanta. So Atalanta is probably the famous female hero of Greek mythology. Kills the Caledonian boar, goes on the mission of the Argonauts, has a foot race for the man who will win her hand in marriage. That takes a long time to find a winner for that. And I've always loved her because she actually gets to do stuff, and so many women in Greek mythology are mothers or daughters or judged by their relationships with others, whereas Atalanta was left on a mountain and raised by bears. How can you not love that? So my introduction of Atalanta into the story of Psyche and Eros was my own innovation. It's not in the source text. I do want to be transparent about that. But as I was writing the first few pages of Psyche and Eros and trying to figure out a direction for the story to take, I had this vision of Atalanta riding a horse through the gates of Tiryns, and so much of the story flowed from that. And part of it I think was just because I love Atalanta so much. But she becomes a mentor figure to Psyche, and Atalanta in my story is very prickly, very laconic, but also very deeply caring. And part of Psyche's character arc and growth is going from viewing Atalanta as an ideal or something she wants to become to viewing Atalanta as a fellow human being.
The question I want to ask is a little spoilery, so I won't.
The people
not the right
the book
day.
only came out today.
I know. You'll need to read this in like the next 2 minutes. Yeah, just extreme speed reading. Talk about Hecate.
Oh. So Hecate was another interpolation from the, no, let me scratch that. Hecate was not in the original source text. I introduced her partly because I was talking about Demeter and Persephone, who are in the original Eros and Psyche myth. But Hecate is the goddess of witchcraft, crossroads, and magic. And when I drafted a scene that she was in, because I was like, let's try this out. And then she grabbed me by both hands, and I was like, okay, you're a major character in this now.
I'm so curious which scene. Can you tell me in a tantalizing way that gives away nothing to
Might be too tall of an order there, but we can talk about that. We can talk about that later. But I was really interested in this image of Hecate as this very liminal figure. She is one of the very few gods that presents as an elderly person. And the reasons for that, you're gonna get in my second book. But she is immensely powerful, also the subject of very questionable dark moon blood sacrifices by mortal people, your standard. But I was also really interested in one of the historical titles for Hecate, which is Sotera, or Savior, Hecate the Savior. So I viewed this as someone who helped those who are beyond all other help, which is often how witches have operated in the modern world. That they're the people you go to when the sickness is severe, they're the person you go to when the person is about to have a baby. So at a certain point, one of the characters goes to Hecate for help, and Hecate does help them. A little bit of a cost. You'll have to read the book and find out more. But Hecate was definitely one of those ones that surprised me. That I was like, maybe I'll bring her up in it, but I don't have to focus on her. No, that's not the way it turned out. And especially for book 2, I feel like there's very much a through line of Hecate through that.
I should not compose all my questions for afterwards. And instead should steer us back. Actually, to the same.
To the safe place.
To the safe place.
This is the place where
The
you
safe
don't
place.
give it all away.
Yes, exactly. The safe place is Persephone. Okay. Actually, what I wanna ask you about is it's so hard to do a Persephone that is not in some way in the shadow of or a reaction to Laura Olympus.
Is it bad if I say I haven't read Laura Olympus?
It's not bad, but I feel like you brought something really interesting to Persephone. So talk a little bit about what inspired your Persephone.
Oh, I'd love to talk about what inspired my Persephone. So Persephone is a figure that appears in the source text for Eros and Psyche, and has this cool role, but Apuleius dropped the ball on really focusing on her, I think. So in writing Persephone, first of all, I was really not interested in writing a Hades Persephone love story. I think that's an interesting interpretation. I think there's some very cool stories coming out that are Hades and Persephone love stories. I just don't see it that way. My reading of the ancient sources is that this very much was a kidnapping and she's kind of stuck there. So in my interpretation of Persephone, she is dragged down to the underworld. She's linked with this husband she hates, but she also kind of finds herself in her element there, and she ends up clawing her way to power in the underworld and being really the main power there. And this was inspired by things I was noticing in a lot of different ancient texts. So in the Odyssey, Persephone is the one who sends out the women to greet Odysseus during his sojourn in the underworld. In the Argonautica, it's Persephone who sends up the ghost of this ancient hero to guide the Argo on its way. There are also all of these curse tablets that are roughly contemporary with Apuleius throughout the Roman Empire that evoke Persephone as the power that you're sending out against other people. So I was seeing these bits and pieces in the historical sources that really introduce Persephone as this figure of power and danger who had been through horrific things, but had also found a place for herself in the underworld as well. And if you think about Persephone as the goddess of flowers, flowers are lovely, but they decay very quickly. And so I wanted to focus on those themes as well. And in terms of her relationship to Psyche, Persephone is very much like the Jungian shadow to Psyche. She's all of the rejected, dangerous, suppressed instincts. And their narrative arcs are parallel but divergent in that both of them are whisked away by husbands they have never met before. Psyche's story ends happily, Persephone's does not. So I had a lot of fun writing Goth Queen Persephone. I think that comes through.
A very early thesis that Eros tosses out is that there's something about death that just makes it possible for mortals to sort of experience a broader menu of love.
Yeah.
And actually, that's a question our books kind of constantly pose, which is what exactly is love?
Yeah, your characters have an explicit conversation about what is love. Can you talk a little more about that?
Well, yeah, it's there's a conversation that happens a third of the way through the book. There's a bunch of people on a boat together before this big cattle raid, and
Try to find the page. It's so good.
it's like chapter 12, I think. And yeah, they basically, Achilles wakes up with a question. She's like, what is love anyway? She's like, just had this horrific breakup with her girlfriend. And she's just like, all of these things, and now I'm not sure what love is. And everyone has a different answer, of course. Like, Odysseus is like, love is, not desire. Love is like the thing that you and your mixed sexual orientation marriage have for your son.
Which is very Greek.
Which is very
It's a very Greek attitude. Why would you love your spouse?
How would you love, well, it's like, why would you love your spouse sexually when you could love your spouse collaboratively to build bigger fleets?
I'm having trouble finding it, but I did bookmark the page, do not slander monkeys. So,
Oh my god. No, I understand that. That's a reasonable priority. Yeah, no.
But we both do have
we've got all these
this
moments
wrestling
where-
with like what love is as well. And I start the novel out with different Greek terms for love, and
Yeah,
that's something that
literally,
something that threads throughout the novel, where I wanted this to be a love story that wasn't specifically about romantic love. And it's the other forms of love that both characters experience that ultimately pave the way for them to come together as a couple.
Yeah, there are a lot of different types of love that are explored here, and it's fascinating. Like, there's the first kind we really see is like Alcaeus and Persephone, or Alcaeus and Psyche, because it's just like, well, I guess I can't throw this infant away. She's her.
Yeah.
Better raise her to be a warrior instead. And as someone who loves, philology, I really enjoyed the fact that you went with those words. I definitely did not have the courage to. Well, also I just didn't know if the Mycenaeans. I was trying to be like period accurate to the Mycenaeans instead of working back from the Roman view. So I had no idea if the Mycenaeans would even consider that a reasonable.
Yeah, there are definitely some things that I'm like, there's a reason this is shelved under fantasy for the most part.
I love the messenger hawks.
Love the messenger. Well, we had to have messenger hawks. How do these characters talk to each other? Oh, I'm gonna give them messenger.
Zephyrus.
Can't all be. He's busy. Zephyrus has things to do. But yeah, there's no archaeological record for the use of messenger hawks in ancient Greece. Also, the Eleusinian mysteries, I talk about those. Those probably weren't really active until hundreds of years later. And some of you already look like you're falling asleep.
Some of them have been pushed back.
Really?
Yeah, I've seen some really interesting stuff.
Do you hear about the shark with the Eleusinian mysteries?
No chance.
Oh my god, I gotta tell you the story. So, part of the preparation for the Eleusinian mysteries was sea bathing, right? So, at one point, I don't know why, I want to say like 380 BCE, a guy was sea bathing with other candidates for the Eleusinian mysteries when a shark came up and ate him. And like, I just picture the other candidates for the mysteries being like, is that a good sign?
Suddenly they all high-five each other.
Yeah.
We made
They're like,
it.
we made it? Is this, I'm not afraid of death anymore. I think that's the point of the mysteries. But yeah, I love that. The guy eaten by a shark, preparing for the Eleusinian mysteries.
He should have known more dolphins.
If only the sleazy dolphins had been there, they could have saved him.
But would they have?
Probably not.
I mean, it depends how cute he was.
I really enjoy, just going back to the dolphins again, I enjoy them so much because like, they gain the ability to talk to people, the first of their kind to do this, and like the first thing they do is like, hey, wanna have a threesome? I love that.
I mean, to be fair, that's just dolphins. That's practically documentary.
I mean, that's the thing. It's like, yeah, I can see that, actually. Like, do you want to fight on our side in this battle we're having with these other dolphins? And Maya Deane is like, we're not getting involved in a dolphin civil war. Stop it.
I mean, you have to explicitly like rein it in and not get involved in dolphin civil wars. Like,
I mean, that could be another divergence for the Iliad.
Dolphin
civil war.
that sounds like the plot of a Roman science fiction novel, which they're so weird. Roman science fiction novels are very different.
Talk more about this.
There's a Roman science fiction novel where a bunch of people go to the moon, and the only way we know about this book, because it's been lost, is because this guy would send his brother long passive-aggressive letters with the entire plot descriptions of books that he liked, and just be like, you should read it. I'm gonna send you a copy. Promise me you'll actually read it. Here, this is the whole plot. I forget the title, but I'll look it up afterwards.
Yeah. What do I know about the Roman moon novel?
No, there are several like Roman science fiction novels. They're so weird.
Yeah. Very strange, very strange. And the tragedy of ancient literature is that we're missing so much of it.
I know.
Like there were, you sound deeply, I'm also deep. I'm still mourning the Library of Alexandria. It's still a problem for me. But just to take over the Eros and Psyche myth again, what we have for that is really only one source. But there are other artistic traditions that we have fragments of. There's a sculpture of Psyche and Eros that's on display at the British Museum that predates Apuleius by like 500 years. There's actually a mosaic showing Psyche and Eros overseeing one of the critical events before the Trojan War. That's from Asia Minor. That's roughly maybe 50 years before Apuleius wrote his version. So I think I'm confident in saying we're both really interested in these versions and narratives that were left out of history, in these stories that kind of fall through the gaps and aren't in the text that survive.
Yeah, and also just in the morphing nature of these stories, like absolutely, like before Apuleius, there was definitely some kind of tradition there. There are moments where it kind of makes you suspect that the stories the donkey overhears. Maybe you guys have any thoughts of stories? He went around stealing random servants' stories. She's like, I'm clever and literary. I did have another question. My other question is, tell me about Clytemnestra. Because that's a choice of version control. Like, in a lot of ways, you took versions of characters that are from very specific kind of, well, this is what we were just talking about. They're sort of, there's not a canon. There's a kind of canon soup.
Well, one thing that I think we had discussed before is like some modern readers read the mythological sources like they're reading the Bible. They're like, well, this wasn't the way it happened here, so that's, you know, that's wrong. And it's like, well, actually the way Statius or Homer or Apuleius would have approached these stories is much more fluid, where there were different traditions in different city-states. There's also an understanding that, like, yeah, maybe Medea's mom is Hecate, maybe Medea's mom is Idea. You know, there was a fluidity in the approach to sources. Where was I going? Clytemnestra, okay, yes. So in writing my version of Clytemnestra, who is Agamemnon's wife, I did some shuffling around with the genealogies there, but she first appears as this like very tight-lipped, stern, disapproving figure who puts a lot of stake in things being done properly. And eventually this is revealed, it's revealed that this is a response to some of her own trauma, because Agamemnon was not her first husband. He killed her first husband and killed her child, and then married her. So she was a slave in her husband's household for a certain amount of time. And she focuses on kind of this version of respectability politics to cope with that. That if you do things the right way, then good things will happen. And after a certain event at Aulis, she starts to see that, like, actually, no, my silence will not save me, it will not save others, and this sets up, well, I didn't have time to tell it in my story, but it sets up a whole other character arc for her. And that's really from, I drew that tradition more from Euripides and from Iphigenia at Aulis than in the Iliad, which I think you point out, like,
She's not dead in the Iliad. She's still alive in the Iliad, and she's also not named Iphigenia. She's named Iphianassa. And at one point, Agamemnon offers her in marriage to Achilles, which would be kind of grotesque if he'd already done that and then murdered her. Yes, yes. That was actually why I was glancing at my phone a second ago. It's a good time to pivot to questions.
Good time to pivot to
I have so many questions that I will get to have answered later. So
That sounds great.
Hey, I'm not familiar with the original story or much of Greek mythology. For readers like me, would you recommend that I familiarize myself with the story to understand the references? Or do you think it's better to go in blind?
I deliberately wrote the story where if you have no background in Greek mythology, you can still enjoy it. So it kind of depends on what you're comfortable with. If you want to dig into the historical sources before you read the book, go for it. If you just want to enjoy a good story, you can read the book first as well.
I think it'd be amazing to have the first experience of the story be your version.
I mean, that is kind of complimentary. I did specifically write it that, like, if you had never read anything in Greek mythology before, you would still get a lot from it.
So, as sort of a follow-up, like, I read this, super psyched, I want to get into more. What versions or like translations or whatever of, say, the Iliad or the Odyssey are ones that you both like, are like, this is the one to read?
So for Lucius Apuleius, The Golden Ass, the 2011 Sarah Rudin translation it's great. She really captures like the kind of playful, irreverent feel of the original. She sort of mimics some of the play on words that he has in the Latin. 2011 Sarah Rudin translation. What do you think for the Iliad?
For the Iliad, I can't answer that question because the Emily Wilson translation is supposed to come out really soon, and I haven't read it yet, but I've heard really good things. I used the Fables and the Caroline Alexander, and a lot of checking against the original Greek and being like, oh, kind of this. But yeah, I would say definitely I expect the Emily Wilson one to be really good because the Odyssey is really good.
Yeah, the Emily Wilson translation of the Odyssey is excellent, and she also really dives into how some of the past translations were not great. Like they use a term for the enslaved women that is not in the original text, and that is a huge value judgment. So Emily Wilson, probably really. I'm excited for that.
Oh, Sam, yeah, we're gonna have to talk about when it comes out.
Yes, can you talk a little bit about your publishing journey as a debut author? The short Course each word.
How long do you have? You're gonna send out a lot of query letters to agents. I think I queried 55 agents before I got mine, and that's on the lower end. And then after you get a literary agent, then they help you edit it, then they pitch to publishers. There's a lot of steps, there's a lot of things that can go wrong. But I think one of the keys there is finding an agent who is pretty established in the field and also that you trust. Because this person is going to be making major business decisions for you and representing you as well. We can talk more later about that.
I know your whole journey, so I was thinking.
So, you know, Eros gives us the word erotic, right? You haven't talked about sex at all.
No, yeah, my parents are here.
I think you did that. Sorry. It's becoming central to the book, and I've just been waiting for this to come up.
Parents. But no, you're right that like erotic love is a type of love. It does occur in the book. It is part of the love between Psyche and Eros. There is a sex scene. So, in case you were worried, Mom and Dad, I'm gonna mark that part. It's a type of love. It does appear in the book. It hopefully appears in many people's lives. What more should I say? Yes.
I was really interested in your bio that you're a social worker. I feel like one of the projects of social work is rendering people who've been treated as stereotypes or two-dimensional and treating them as whole people. I feel like it sounds like from the discussion, a lot of that is in the book as well. So how did that work influence your writing?
I really like that question. So I'm an ex-academic turned social worker. I got my master's degree in the study of gender and religion, and then realized that academia was a dumpster fire. And actually, I really liked talking to people. I really liked helping them, and still figuring out the work-life balance. But having one career where you're talking to people in depth and listening to them and helping them through the struggles of life, and then balancing that with this very solitary, very imaginative career has been incredible. Social work is often very difficult. It's also very rewarding, and the certain thing about it is that you need a lot of characters. And I have a very strict delineation of like, I do not talk about my social work in my novels. That would be a violation of patient confidentiality. But it does give me a sense of how human beings interact in the world. So Tony Gilroy, who is the writer for the television show Andor and also for Rogue One, if there are any Star Wars nerds here, has a saying that the quality of your writing is capped at your understanding of human behavior. And so if you really get people, you're going to create interesting characters and you're going to create plots that move forward. And also sometimes it's nice to just entirely step away from writing for a while.
I was interested in hearing a little about your process of writing. I've gone to other author talks, and I'm very interested. There's all different ways to approach the process of writing.
So the way I usually approach it is like I start with writing down whatever ideas I can't stop thinking about. So the image of Atalanta riding into the city of Tiryns was one of these images that was so central to what I was thinking about the book. And so I just write down whatever I have. And sometimes it'll be nice and I'll have an idea that occurs towards the beginning of the book, and other times I'll have a thought for how the book should wrap up or how it should end. And I write that down as well. But the key is really keeping all of that organized, I'm realizing. I have one draft where everything is, for a working project, work in process, everything is all over the place. I'm gonna need to really sort that out. But I think just writing what needs to be written first has been very helpful for me.
Are you more of a planner or an editor? Some writers have everything really organized and they block out all very work in a careful way and they stick to it. Other writers start writing, they have ideas, and then things go off the rails about 10 minutes in, and they have to edit it all to make sense later. Which do you fall on that spectrum? Are you off that spectrum entirely, doing something else?
I'm a little bit of both. So I have like the ideas that I can't stop thinking about, the ideas that need to be written first that I write down. And I often do have something of a plan. My publishing editors recently introduced me to the idea of a synopsis, which is that's great. But I'm not great at coloring in the lines or following rules, so I'll like write a synopsis and then be like, well, this character doesn't actually want to do this, so they're gonna go somewhere else. Oh, this climactic scene, actually that can't work for this reason, so we're going to change it.
When was the first time you heard about the story of Psyche and Eros?
I have like a cute little article about this, but I was like pretty young, like I want to say like 7 or 8 or something at Girl Scout camp, where it was one of the stories we were telling around the fire, and the counselor was telling the story of like these man and woman who loved each other but couldn't see each other. They're separated, and the female half of the pair was the one who had to undertake the heroic labors to win back her beloved. It's like little tiny Luna was like, "That's cool. I like it." And you know, that was just a very like oral lore version. And when I read the actual text itself, I was like, "This is different." And now I have created a version of my own that is also different.
Do you have any tips for young writers?
Oh, I love this. I'm trying to like put myself back into my teenage years. So this might be a controversial bit of advice. Write fan fiction. Right? Well, hold on. Because it's free, you have an immediate community. You also get to start practicing some of the skills you'll need in the future as a writer. You start noticing what are comp texts, what are the tropes and techniques that are used by other authors, what are the types of stories that are getting a lot of hits. And actually I found my beta reader, who's like a huge part of my writing process, through my own fan fiction writing. So you also start to build a community as well. And it's also just fun. It is creativity for the sake of creativity. And I think that matters a lot, and I think there's a lot of value to that in a world that tries to put a price on everything. advice is just don't stop. Just keep writing what gives you joy to write. Show it to other people when you can. If you can afford classes, that's wonderful. Not everyone can, but that's where the fan fiction comes.
Thank you.
You're welcome. One more question. One more minute.
One more song.
One more something.
Question for both. You've obviously done a lot of research, and you've obviously read a lot of source material. You've mentioned a number of sources or interpretations that impressed you. What are some sources or interpretations you've read that made you want to do a face palm?
Oh, that's interesting. I mean, mostly if I start reading something like that, I don't have time. Like, life is short. I'm not spending the time I have on Earth reading that.
I'm a Statius anti.
Talk more about that.
I mean, you know, sometimes you just read a version that makes you mad and you're like, wow, this Roman was a jerk.
And Statius was the one who was like, Achilles being very manly by dressing as a woman and raping this princess. Right?
Exactly, and I was just like, wow, okay, cool. Some things never change. But yeah, there aren't that many Psyche and Eros versions, are there? Like, actually, this is totally off topic, but how will you feel when someone writes that version of Psyche and Eros?
I cannot wait. I'm so excited. I got my first cosplayer the other day. At the.
You better have a picture.
Well, no. So, I'll tell you. Oh, hold on. So it was someone who worked with my editor at the publishing house. I was able to meet some of them, and he was like, "Oh, you wrote Psyche and Eros. Oh, I dressed up as Eros for Halloween." He showed me a picture, and I was like, "Wait, can we use this?" And he's like, "No, you can see my nipples." So I was like, "Oh, cosplayer." He's very excited for the fan fiction of Psyche and Eros.
So, you know, if someone wants to become a really skillful author, maybe you start with Psyche and Eros.